Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 544, A Day in the Life of Meiji Japan, Part 2. We left off last week with a discussion of school and work life in the Meiji period, and we're going to pick up right where we left off. But I want to spend some time talking about another job, so to speak, that was new and distinct in the Meiji era. You see, one of the defining features of Meiji Japan was the imposition, in 1873, of universal conscription, subjecting all adult men to service in the army or the navy, but more likely the former than the latter. The imposition of conscription proved challenging to say the least, both because of the long-standing social hierarchies of the feudal era. Samurai were not thrilled about commoners honing in on their turf, and not a lot of commoners were too enthused about giving up their lives and jobs to go fight, and because some unfortunate phrasing in the original text of the ordinance, that the people of Japan were paying back an obligation to the state in the form of a tax paid in blood, meant rumors began to swirl that the government was literally planning to steal people's blood. As you might imagine, the vampiric implications of this phrasing didn't go over super well, and resulted in riots in a few places in the countryside. In reality, that blood tax phrasing actually comes from post-revolutionary France, when the Jacobin and Napoleonic-era mass conscriptions were replaced with a lottery system that you could pay your way out of or find a substitute to replace yourself with. Despite these initial speed bumps, conscription did work at creating a military that could both suppress domestic dissent against the new order and win Japan's overseas wars, helping the new state build up its imperial prestige. By 1900, the practice and the new career it offered, so to speak, were embedded in the fabric of Meiji life. The way it worked was pretty straightforward. At 17, all men were enrolled in a registry maintained by the army. And as an aside, given both the greater technical challenges involved in being a seaman and the fact that naval service offered greater chances at technical training, useful in post-demobilization life, at first the Navy relied on volunteers to fill out its enlisted ranks. By the 20th century, it had grown to the point that some reliance on conscription was necessary, but if you were conscripted in Meiji Japan or later, you were much more likely to go to the army than the Navy. The army just had more demand for recruits. Anyway, at age 20, adult males would then go through a physical exam to determine their fitness for conscription. It's not entirely clear why 20 was chosen as the conscription age, particularly given that theoretically men were already in the candidate pool at 17. That specific age appears to have been chosen by Yamagata Aritomo, one of the leading figures of Meiji Japan and the godfather, in essence, of the imperial army. Yamagata, in turn, appears to have seen 20 as the natural bridge point between secondary school and the job market. As he put it, young men would, quote, enter primary school at age 6, switch to the middle school at 13, finish their studies at 19, and serve in the military at 20. If that was the vision, though, Yamagata was very off base as to how it would play out. The 1873 conscription ordinance allowed young men to get out of military service by either paying the government 270 yen, a literal tax instead of a blood one, or being enrolled in higher education. This more or less guaranteed that only the sons of poorer families, who in turn just went through mandatory primary schooling before going into the job market, would be conscripted. In other words, young men who had already been working for a few years before they were conscripted. In particular, conscription hit young men from poorer rural families the hardest, though realistically, your odds of being conscripted were never that high. Only about 10% of young men who were examined during the Meiji period actually got conscripted. By a few decades after Meiji, in the mid-1930s, that number had risen, but only to 22%. The army was always reluctant to take too many recruits at once, even in wartime, both because of concerns around the quality of recruits and the limited army budget, and because, given how many of these young men were being uprooted from jobs in the countryside, pulling too many out of the economy at once would be bad for the national tax base. Anyway, the conscription exam would sort potential recruits into a series of categories, and generally only those in Category A, in good physical condition and taller than 1.55 meters, which is about 5 feet 1 inches, were really eligible for the draft. That's not to say that if you weren't Category A, you were guaranteed not to be drafted. The categories went all the way down to B, C, D, and E. B and C went down to the 1st and 2nd reserves, eligible for call-up to replace casualties in wartime, while D was for criminals or the physically or mentally unfit to serve. E categorization was for those who were sick at the time of the exams. They had to be re-examined the following year. Those who were put into Group A were then entered into a lottery to determine which ones would actually be conscripted, and informed of such by means of a red postcard telling them to report to the nearest base. For these men, conscription was, at best, a mixed blessing. On the one hand, jobs in the countryside didn't pay particularly well, and given that most were poor tenant farmers, life was not very stable, and army life is nothing if not a stable paycheck, at least as long as you don't die. On the other hand, being conscripted meant losing whatever work you did have, with no guarantee you'd get your job back after your 3 years of service were up, and the pay was, at best, adequate. Really, it was not great by any measure. A new recruit in 1936 got 2 yen 75 sen a month, the equivalent of about 65 cents. By comparison, if you joined the United States Army in the same year, you would have landed a whole 21 bucks a month. Even a Japanese sergeant living outside the barracks with a family, the best pay you could land on the non-commissioned officer scale, netted 78 yen a month, just a bit better than the average wages of a day laborer at 64 yen, and with substantially higher odds of getting shot. These hardships, combined with the fact that they hit a relatively small number of families who often could not really afford the cost of having a son conscripted, created a big sense of unfairness among the families affected. This in turn created a strong market for methods to try and evade the draft. Early on in the Meiji years, one of the most common was to try and take advantage of the mixed quality of record keeping to cheat the household registry, or koseki system. This was the government system that registered every household in the country, maintained at the local level, and then reported up the chain all the way to the prefectural and eventually the national government. The koseki was the basis of everything from taxation to tracking land ownership, but particularly in the early Meiji years, the quality of bookkeeping was very mixed. And so, when their sons were just about to turn 20, rural families in the early Meiji years were known to go to local officials and ask them to correct a mistake. Their son was 21, you see, not 20. Just a bookkeeping error in the system. These things happen. Oh, and that conveniently means they can't be called up for the conscription physical, that's for 20-year-olds, and thus won't be in the draft lottery. You might be asking yourself, how well could such bald-faced cheating actually work? Well enough that some villages had no young men taking the exam at all, despite the growing population. And it wasn't the only method of cheating. Other tricks included deliberately undernourishing yourself to appear unfit, or drinking a boatload of salty soy sauce to replicate the symptoms of a heart condition. After the Russo-Japanese War in particular, an upwelling of patriotism in the countryside saw a bit more buy-in to conscription, with young men's groups, the so-called Seinendan, setting goals for their members of passing their physicals, and describing the whole exercise as equivalent to the Genpuku, the coming-of-age ceremony for male members of the samurai class of old. But in 1900, we're not quite there yet. And if you did enter the army with a rosy notion of what it would be like, you'd probably be disabused of that when you reported for basic. Training in the Imperial Japanese Army was notoriously brutal for recruits. After a send-off from their home, which particularly after the Russo-Japanese War would take on more of a patriotic, ceremonial cast, but which initially was more of a private affair for the affected families, recruits would go by train for their training. Where exactly they reported would depend on where they were from. Recruits were enrolled in regimental barracks based on their koseki registration. This was true not just of the infantry, but other branches too, logistics, artillery, cavalry, and so on. The only exceptions were the Guards Division, responsible for protecting Tokyo, and eventually the 19th and 20th Divisions, which were permanently stationed in Korea, and thus pulled from recruits all over Japan. Ostensibly, the new division was an ideological extension of one's family and community. This was true in both a very literal sense. Part of the idea behind the geographically bounded regiments was that you would remain with your local community after conscription, and thus be motivated to protect them, to avoid disgracing yourself in a way that would make it back home, and a metaphorical one as well. For example, the 1908 Guntai Naimusho, or Army Administration Handbook, explicitly used the metaphorical language of family. Quote, "The barracks is the soldier's family, where together soldiers share hardships and joys, life and death. The heads of the household are the father and mother. The company commanders is the strict father, the NCO a loving mother. The lieutenants are relatives in perfect accord with their company commander, whom they loyally assist." Theoretically, this was all supposed to be a support structure for the new recruit, both their parents and the second-year conscripts who served as older brothers, showing the ropes, all of them from roughly the same area of the country, so they would share local customs, local dialect, all those things. However, the hierarchy of this system was also extremely prone to abuse. Harsh beatings were commonly doled out for any failures to live up to expectations, because, after all, failure reflected poorly on the family as a whole. And the rules you were expected to live up to were numerous. Equipment had to be carefully maintained, as all of it was a gift from the greatest father of them all, the Emperor himself. So, for example, a failure to maintain your Type 38 rifle, marked with a chrysanthemum crest of the imperial family, meant you were disrespecting the Emperor, and that could not stand. Recruits were also not allowed to read newspapers, magazines, or books without official permission, so that they were not exposed to incorrect ideologies, and had to memorize a substantial new vocabulary of specialized military language, with mistakes in that language, of course, being met with harsh punishment. Lucky for them, they were not expected to memorize the entire 1882 imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, the proclamation that declared to all members of the military in the voice of the Emperor, quote, "Our relations with you will be most intimate when we rely upon you as our limbs and you look upon us as your head. Whether we are able to guard the empire and so prove ourselves worthy of heaven's blessings and repay the benevolence of our ancestors depends on the faithful discharge of your duties as soldiers and sailors. If the power and majesty of our empire be impaired, do you share with us the sorrow. If the glory of our arms shine resplendent, we will share with you the honor." The whole rescript was 2,700 characters long and contained kanji obscure enough most college graduates couldn't read them without a dictionary. But you did have to memorize a shortened version called the 5 Principles for the Soldier. In some units, you had to repeat the whole thing verbatim before breakfast and could not sit down to eat before you did. Soldiers were drilled hard in rote obedience, for example being ordered to stand at attention all day long until they collapsed and then being beaten for their failure of spirit in not remaining standing. The goal of this brutality was to break down any sense of independent identity or tendency to question orders, so that soldiers would leave basic training automatically obeying every order they were given. One former artilleryman recalled, quote, "Everyone's face was black and blue, and mine was the worst because I got hit the most. Only my eyes and teeth stood out because the rest of my face was black and blue." As you might have already noticed, this created an atmosphere of rather casual brutality. Honestly, the closest analog I can think of is really bad hazing. For example, court-martials in the army were very rare, but not because infractions were uncommon. Instead, squads were given substantial leeway to deal out punishment internally, with second-year soldiers holding kangaroo courts in the hour or so between when officers went to their barracks for the night and official lights out. There, anyone who had embarrassed the whole platoon, flubbing an exercise or showing up with an oil stain on their boots or something like that, would be tried and punished with everything from slappings to beatings. As one returning conscript put it, quote, "In the light of the full moon, the senior soldiers turn into demons." The first 4 months were the time of the worst physical abuse. After that point, soldiers were considered broken down enough to start in on a 4-month small unit training cycle, culminating in an autumn training exercise usually personally witnessed by the Emperor. Once that was done, the third years would begin preparing to demobilize in a couple months, the second years preparing to step into their shoes, and the first years would get ready to take their turn, being a bit more senior and dealing out more of the beatings. So this has all been very depressing, but fortunately we have 2 more subjects to move on to before we're done. So let's leave behind career life in the Meiji era and focus on something a little bit more fun. Specifically, we're going to return to our fictional member of Meiji society, bringing them home from work or school or army service, and ask ourselves 2 final questions. What would they eat for lunch or an evening meal, and what would they do for fun? So starting with food, I think you could argue from a certain perspective that a lot of what we think of as Japanese cuisine was actually born during the Meiji era. Which might seem strange to say on its face, and it's true there are a lot of popular dishes today that have roots going back quite a bit further. Sushi, of course, has a very long history, as does the fancy dining known as kaiseki, for example. But a lot more dishes got added to the Japanese repertoire thanks to the cultural mixing of the Meiji years. One of the biggest shifts driving this change was the addition of meat, and especially beef, to the Japanese diet. We covered this a bit in the episode on pre-modern whaling in Japan, but meat consumption was actually very rare for a lot of Japanese history, for many of the same reasons it was rare in a lot of the world. It was expensive, and meat is hard to preserve. In addition, the dominance of Buddhism as a cultural force limited meat eating to a certain extent. There were smaller hunter communities that relied on meat as a big part of their diets in the more remote parts of the country, but for much of the Japanese population, mammals just weren't on the menu, the only exception being the occasional medicinal consumption of mammals, usually deer or wild boar. For most, even chicken was an extreme rarity. By the late Edo period, this had begun to change, but only very slightly. For example, the scholar Fukuzawa Yukichi describes 2 restaurants serving beef in the whole of Osaka before 1870, though he noted they were also, quote, low-class shops never visited by civilized people. Similarly, Edo, the future Tokyo, developed a small number of shops selling boar, deer, fox, rabbit, and the like, but meat as a foodstuff really came in with the opening of the treaty ports to Western residents in the final decades or so of the Tokugawa shogunate. These Europeans and Americans brought with them an appetite for beef, though they quickly discovered nobody in Japan consumed it. Cows were actually so important as labor for farming families, they were sometimes buried on family plots after death, so consuming one would have been a hard sell, to put it mildly. At first, treaty ports like Yokohama had to ship in cattle from Korea, China, or America. The cows were even butchered aboard ship because there were no Japanese butchers who knew how to do it. Eventually, Yokohama's foreign community was able to make an arrangement with cattle stock breeders in the hills of the Kansai area, where most of Japan's farm cattle were ranched, to ship 30 or 40 head at a time from Kobe to Yokohama for food. This earliest beef ranching is also why Kobe beef started to develop the reputation it has today. Apparently, the eaters of Yokohama were impressed by the taste. As we covered last week, after the fall of the shogunate, the new government set up a public corporation, the Gyuba Kaisha, to handle dairy and beef production in 1869, run by the Ministry of Finance. Initially, most of its cows actually came from the lands of the former shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, whose assets were confiscated by the new regime. Unfortunately, the new company was also a bit of a train wreck. Like most early Meiji corporations run by the government, it was less of a functional business and more of a way to employ former samurai and keep them happy, and thus less likely to start stabbing government leaders all willy-nilly. The Gyuba Kaisha was a mess from the go and shut down before too long, but not before it established a very important precedent. You see, one of the big jobs of the Gyuba Kaisha was to supply the army and navy, where Tokugawa-era beliefs that eating mammals was good for the sick or injured did still hold some sway. And so it was the soldiers and sailors who, starting during the Boshin Civil War of 1868-69, began eating beef under advice from their doctors, and found they had a taste for it, and then carried the custom back home. Both the Army and Navy in particular were the ones who began issuing to their members cans of tinned meat flavored with soy sauce and ginger called yamatoni, and demobilized soldiers and sailors brought that foodstuff home. Yamatoni remained very popular until the mid-50s or so. The other common way to eat beef during the Meiji years was stew. Of course, stew is easy, cheap, and comparatively hard to screw up. By 1877, there were 558 restaurants serving beef stew in the newly rechristened Tokyo, this according to a contemporary newspaper. The practice caught on quickly in the cities, less so in the countryside where traditional hesitancies around consuming cow, or horse, a cheaper alternative, remained until the early 20th century. By around 1900, the recipe for beef stew had started to standardize, becoming more or less today's sukiyaki, though beef remained expensive enough, even in stew form, that sukiyaki was not an everyday food unless you were very rich. In fact, it was actually because beef was so expensive that the government began introducing another livestock animal to meet the growing demand for meat. Large-scale pig breeding for pork was first introduced by the government in 1868, but it didn't really take off until the Russo-Japanese War, when government mandated rationing for beef, for of course its military medicinal use, meant that cheaper meats were necessary. Chicken also started to pick up popularity during this period. After all, it is the cheapest of the big three, so to speak. It was mostly consumed at yoshokuya, somewhat deceptively named foreign food restaurants that served what their owners claimed was exotic foreign-style food to a Meiji audience hungry for these classy new flavors. In reality, yoshokuya didn't really serve foreign food at all. The menus almost always included rice, and usually everything was covered in Worcestershire sauce. Many Japanese cooks erroneously assumed this was the Western equivalent of soy sauce and basically went on everything. The hits on these menus included things like deep-fried chicken, pork, potato croquet, or rice with bits of beef and chicken, and a profoundly de-spiced version of Indian curry plus rice, the origin, of course, of curry rice, which alongside tonkotsu, the fried pork cutlet, was far and away the most popular dish created by the yoshokuya. Thus, by the end of the Meiji years, chicken, pork, and beef were all a part of Japanese cuisine, but they were not yet staples. By the mid-30s, the average Japanese person was eating 6.1 grams of meat a day. For reference, some cursory Googling suggests the average Japanese national today consumes around 90 grams, Americans well over 100. Thus, meat was clearly popular, but it was not widespread. Other staple dishes came about during the Meiji era by very different means. For example, the growing trade with China, and eventually colonization of parts of it, brought growing numbers of Chinese people to Japan, where they set up Chinatowns around the country, the largest one in Yokohama. Chinese restaurants never got as big as Western ones. In 1923, Tokyo had 1,000 Chinese restaurants compared to 5,000 of the Western-style yoshokuya, but the cuisine still had its fans. In particular, a dish called Shina soba men, or Chinese soba noodles, basically noodles and chicken or pork broth with a slice of pork and black pepper, was an increasingly popular dish. Starting around 1918, it became a standard fare for street peddlers and food stall owners, since it was easy to prep in large batches and serve quickly. The name is also a bit deceptive, by the way. The basic notion of noodle dish plus broth plus pepper plus meat has a long history in China, but all of these ingredients are Japanese. Anyway, these Chinese-style noodles were popular, but it wasn't until after World War II that the dish was rebranded as ramen, and really started to take off. As for the entertainments of the Meiji era, what you might do for fun in 1900, well, honestly, there's a lot to say. One of the important ideas to remember about the Meiji era is that, while it did have a lot of big firsts, by 1900, Japan already had a very developed urban culture. As a result, restaurants, theaters, all that stuff, all of it had histories in the big city, especially in places like Tokyo and Osaka, going back centuries at this point. Given that reality, there is no way we could even come close to a wide-ranging coverage of Meiji period entertainments, And so instead, I'm going to focus on two very different subjects with very different stories to give you some idea of the gamut of options potentially available. So, you've eaten some dinner, you're looking for one more thing to do before you call it a night. I'm going to give you two options. Go see some kabuki, or go to the movies. Kabuki, of course, has a very long history well before the Meiji period, though compared to other famous forms of theater like No, it's a relatively recent invention. By the late Tokugawa years, though, kabuki performances had already begun to fall on hard times. You see, in the final decades of feudalism in Japan, the leadership of the old shogunate was well aware that things were going poorly for the country, and that something had to change to revitalize things and deal with the growing foreign threat. But their conception of what to do was very skewed by a very traditionally Confucian worldview, which privileged virtuous austerity and moral example as the key sources of social stability. And so the final attempts to reform the shogunate, such as the Tenpo reforms of the 1840s, spent less time on reforming the economic base of the government and bureaucracy, and more on banning anything seen as damaging to all that austere virtue. Kabuki, with its riotous and over-the-top performances, fit the bill pretty naturally, and many theaters were shut down or forced to relocate. One of Edo/Tokyo's most famous actors, Ichikawa Danjiro VII, ended up being exiled from the city. Those prohibitions were eventually lifted, but by the 1850s and 1860s, suddenly nobody had much time for theater. And given the dire economic straits of the final years of feudalism, nobody really had much money either. The early years of Meiji theater were then dominated, depending on where you fell politically, by a drive for ardent westernization, in which case kabuki was all outmoded nonsense and you were better off with modern theater like opera, or extreme nationalist traditionalism, where kabuki was seen as part of the degenerate order which had corrupted an older, purer Japanese tradition. Various attempts to reform kabuki theater during the 1870s and 1880s were generally unsuccessful, producing plays that were either wildly experimental in their style or slavishly imitative of Western theater. That second trend was probably the most popular. In 1866, a convention of leading political and economic figures established something called the Engeki Kairyokai, or Society for Theater Reform, intended to produce recommendations for updating kabuki to modern taste. The membership of this committee was very impressive, including political leaders like Suimatsu Kensho, who was about to become home minister, and Inoue Kaoru, the foreign minister, as well as business leaders like Shibusawa Eiichi. The final recommendations were for a more austere and simplistic form of theater, abandoning certain musical elements as well as the hanamichi walkways that ran through the crowd, and the elimination of onnagata, the men playing the women's roles, to create a more universal theater experience. Those recommendations were shockingly not very popular with kabuki dramatists themselves, who experimented with wildly different forms to try and fit Meiji trends. Some became masters of a related form called shimpa, essentially shortened dramas based on current events, though those never became super popular. Others looked to foreign theater. There was a long run of kabuki troupes putting on Shakespeare plays, though to very mixed results. The first one, run in Osaka in 1885, was The Merchant of Venice, and the missing cultural context there meant there was not much clarity among the audience as to what the play was actually about. Meanwhile, a staging of Othello in 1903 had some rewrites. Iago was executed at the end to make the conclusion more satisfying, but during the first staging, the actors messed up and executed Othello instead. Ultimately, the most successful reforms were brought about by a pair of actors, Ichikawa Danjiro IX and Onoe Kikugoro V. Ichikawa, of course, is the better remembered of the two. He was the fifth son of Danjiro VII, and probably the most famous actor of his own day, too. He was also reported to be a bit of an egomaniac, but his influence allowed for him to push reforms to kabuki that did end up stabilizing the genre, so to speak. Those reforms mostly involved preserving kabuki to the greatest extent possible, taking it from a contemporary form of theater to a part of Japan's cultural heritage that had to remain in a sort of unchanging, idealized state. His influence brought in money and subsidies to keep the major theaters alive. He basically built the Kabukiza, the most famous theater in Tokyo. If you were going to see a play in 1900, you would have missed the chance to see him live. He did retire in 1899 and would die in 1903, but his influence would be strongly felt. Unless you went to a smaller theater, you'd likely see a performance from the canon of the great plays of the Tokugawa era, and the main reason you'd probably go is a desire to reconnect with a part of Japan's cultural heritage. Kabuki's survival as a genre had a lot to do with a revived interest in the art during the nationalistic upsurges brought about by the victorious wars against China and Russia. Alternatively, you could go to the movies, a place Ichikawa Danjiro IX would not be caught dead in. And I mean that very literally. He hated cinema. He did allow a performance of his from the play Momiji Gari, Maple Leaf Viewing, to be filmed in 1899, but supposedly the only reason he did it was because he felt he was leaving a gift, his own performance, for posterity. He did only one take, and as a condition of filming, the film could not be released until after he died. Of course, that sort of loathing for film as a genre was not universal, though I imagine Ichikawa Danjiro IX was not the only old-school theater type who felt some dislike, perhaps one could even say threat, from film as a genre. Still, by the end of the Meiji period, Japan did have a nascent film industry all its own, though for our hypothetical person experiencing daily life in 1900, the offerings are still pretty bare. But, I mean, of course they would be. Thomas Edison's kinetoscope wasn't even shown commercially in the US until 1894. It didn't make its way to Japan for the first time until 1896. Most of what you'd be able to go see in 1900 were what you could loosely call documentaries, basically short recordings of events around the country, from famous landmarks and nightlife in Tokyo to geisha performances in Kyoto. Still, film remained pretty niche, something you'd use to go see the sights somewhere you couldn't afford to travel yourself, or something you'd go to in order to be edified by clips of great kabuki performances. Oh, what a gift that performance in Momiji Gari was, how thoughtful of Ichikawa Danjiro to record it. But what really changed the status of film as a medium was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. This was, of course, the conflict that really saw Japan emerge as a great power in the world order. It was also the first one where photographs or even basic film cameras were available in large enough numbers to begin substantially documenting the conflict. For comparison, the earlier Sino-Japanese War had largely been documented via woodblock prints made by artists carrying second-hand accounts of the fighting, very stylized and artistically impressive, not the most accurate. The chance to see what was really going on was a big draw for theatergoers during the conflict, particularly since the level of national mobilization imposed by the Russo-Japanese War meant everyone had a stake in it. Even if you or someone you knew was not fighting, you were certainly impacted by the rationing and the higher taxes. The war boom in turn laid the basic groundwork for the wider cinema industry. Starting around 1908, the very first domestic film production companies started to come together. Just for comparison, Nestor Studios, the first film production house to set up shop in Hollywood, opened its doors in 1911. Unfortunately, much of this early cinematic output is lost. Film preservation was not really a thing in the early years of cinema, and at any rate the Second World War burned a lot of documentation that otherwise would be very useful to us. We know that a lot of the first feature films were recorded using kabuki actors. For example, one of Japan's first big film producers, Makino Shozo, had a more or less exclusive contract with the acting troupe of Onoe Matsunosuke. Makino had initially owned a kabuki theater in Kyoto at which Onoe's troupe worked, until the pair were approached by a film import company called Yokota to begin making their own films. I do also want to note that Onoe Matsunosuke was apparently nicknamed Madama no Matchan or Mr. Eyeballs Matsu for his crazy eyes on screen. These early films were relatively short, usually about 200 feet of film, which some quick Googling suggests makes for slightly over 10 minutes of runtime at a standard frame rate. There were longer ones, though. Makino and Onoe Matsunosuke produced a version of Chushingura over 7,000 feet long, so several hours in length. These early films, of course, were all silent. Narration was provided by a benshi, a narrator who would explain the story and riff off the action of it over the course of the film. That Benshi role drew from earlier theatrical performance traditions in Japan. It's unique to Japanese film history so far as I know, though of course the invention of the talkies eventually brought it to an end. So, that brings us home after a long day of work and fun, hopefully a bit wiser now about how the changes of the Meiji era impacted people's daily lives. And that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japanesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time for the first part of a two-part series on the post-war Japanese extreme right.